The bitter wind of January sliced through my thin coat like a blade as I pushed open the heavy glass doors of Hartwell's, one of the most exclusive Italian restaurants in Chicago's River North district, where I had been working for exactly 3 months and 2 days. My fingers were numb. My cheeks burned red from the cold. And the hairstyle I had carefully perfected for half an hour that morning now hung in damp, defeated strands around my face. I was already 10 minutes late for my shift. "Claire, where have you been, Kevin?" The evening manager hissed between clenched teeth as I hurried through the kitchen, fumbling to tie the black apron around my waist. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by something I had never seen before, something close to panic. "Table 7. VIPs. You're serving them tonight." "What? But that's Lisa's section." I stammered, my hands trembling as I tightened the knot on my apron. "Lisa called in sick. Listen to me, Claire. This group, they're important. Very important. Don't screw this up." There was something in his voice that made my stomach twist. I nodded, smoothed out my dress, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. I needed this job desperately. 6 months ago, I had fled Boston with nothing but a single suitcase, and whatever courage I had left after my ex-boyfriend's charm had slowly curdled into something darker, controlling, and dangerous. Chicago was supposed to be my new beginning, but new beginnings were never cheap. My tiny apartment in Uptown devoured most of my paycheck, and every shift at Hartwell's was a matter of survival. "Who are they?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I grabbed my order pad. Kevin's eyes darted around the kitchen as if afraid someone might overhear. Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Mr. Hartwell's business partners." My blood ran cold. Everyone at Hartwell's knew the name, Julian Hartwell, the elusive owner. Never seen in person, always spoken of in hushed tones, as though he were a ghost haunting the empire he'd built. Some said he was just a wealthy investor. Others whispered he was involved in things far more dangerous. "They're in the private dining room at the end of the hall." Kevin continued, "Remember, Claire, be professional, efficient." His gaze lingered on me for a moment. "And invisible." Invisible. Lately, that had become second nature to me, keeping my head down, avoiding attention, blending into the background noise of every crowded room. I took a deep breath, straightened my posture, and pushed through the kitchen door. The main dining room of Hartwell's glowed under warm golden light, crystal glasses shimmering beneath the French chandeliers, white tablecloths gleaming against the dark mahogany floors. It was the kind of wealth that didn't need to boast, refined, quiet, and absolute. I walked through the dining area with my back straight and chin slightly raised, just as I had been trained. Beyond the main floor, a narrow hallway led to the private dining suites reserved for the restaurant's most important guests. I stopped before the heavy wooden door, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the hum of the restaurant behind me. Then I knocked softly once, and pushed it open. And there, inside that dimly lit room, heavy with the scent of aged wine and quiet tension, sat a man who would change my life forever. The air in the room seemed to thicken the moment I stepped inside, not because of the temperature, but because of the man seated at the center of the long, white-clothed table, surrounded by 3 others in impeccably tailored suits. They were speaking in low, steady tones, the kind of conversation that carried weight, even in silence. But when I entered, all 4 turned to look at me. My throat tightened, and yet my gaze was instantly drawn to one man alone. He sat slightly back in his chair, one hand resting lightly on the armrest. He said nothing, but from the very first glance, I knew I was standing before someone unlike anyone who had ever walked into this restaurant. His dark hair was neatly combed, a few soft curls brushing near his temples. The black suit he wore was flawless, his crisp white shirt edged with gray, the silk tie perfectly knotted. He didn't need an introduction. I didn't need anyone to say his name. I knew, without question. This was Julian Hartwell. I had heard whispers about the mysterious owner behind the restaurant, the businessman who never appeared in person, who ruled everything through a few phone calls and a nod from afar. But what I saw now was more than rumor. His eyes met mine, calm and unreadable. Not aggressive, not probing, but with a quiet intensity that rooted me to the spot. It wasn't the gaze of a stranger. It was the look of someone who had just recognized something ancient, something familiar. I felt as if I had stepped onto a stage midway through a play whose script I had never seen. "Good evening. Gentlemen, my name is Claire. I'll be serving you tonight," I said, forcing my voice into steady calm. Julian tilted his head slightly. Saying nothing, one of the other men, seated to his right, spoke up to order. His voice was gravelly, with an East Coast inflection. I took notes, my hand trembling ever so slightly. I could feel Julian's eyes on me steady, observing, as if tracing every small motion. When I turned to leave with the order, I heard his voice, quiet but clear, not directed at anyone in particular. "How long has she been working here?" I froze for a heartbeat but didn't turn around. Kevin slipped into the room behind me, carrying a bottle of wine. I heard his soft reply, 3 months. A little over 2. A chill ran down my spine. I brought the order to the kitchen, forcing myself to breathe evenly, to think of nothing. But the rest of the evening, I could still feel that gaze following me distant, unwavering. I served with precision, spoke only when necessary, avoided lingering glances, avoided any connection that wasn't part of my job. Yet somehow, every movement felt seen. When the guests finally left, Kevin approached. "Claire, head to the manager's office. Someone wants to see you." I wiped my hands, hesitated for a moment, and made my way to the back. The hallway was quiet. I knocked gently on the door. "Come in." "A voice," said his voice, unmistakably. Julian Hartwell was standing beside a small bookshelf, a glass of wine in hand. He was no longer in the elegant black suit. Now he wore a charcoal turtleneck sweater, simple yet effortlessly refined. He turned toward me, his expression composed, thoughtful, almost as if weighing something. "You speak Italian, don't you?" he asked. I froze, unsure how to respond. "I heard you on the phone earlier. Before you came to the table, you were speaking Italian. Your pronunciation is good." I nodded slightly. "It was my grandmother. She's in a nursing home. I grew up with her, so I speak both languages." Julian nodded, taking a slow sip of wine. "I need someone like you for a short assignment. Translation: a few conversations with Italian partners. Just a few days." I frowned. "I'm a waitress, not a professional interpreter." He smiled faintly, just enough for me not to tell whether it was genuine or polite. "I don't need a professional. I need someone I can trust. And tonight, you walked in at the right moment." I said nothing. There were too many thoughts crowding my mind to choose one. Julian set his glass down, crossed the room, and opened the door. "My plane leaves Chicago tomorrow morning. I want you to come with me. All expenses covered. You'll be well compensated." He paused, his eyes steady on mine. "But you'll have to decide tonight. If you agree, be ready by 7 in the morning." I stood there, caught between the open door and that inscrutable gaze. Reason told me to walk away, but somewhere deep inside, a quieter voice whispered that perhaps my life was about to turn onto a road I wasn't yet brave enough to name. I couldn't sleep that night. All the way back to my small uptown apartment, my mind kept circling around his words. His eyes, those eyes that seemed to see straight through me from the very first moment. A private plane. Translation work. A few days. All expenses covered. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a riddle I couldn't quite solve. I made a cup of tea but never drank it. Sitting alone in the tiny kitchen under the dim yellow bulb, I stared into the emptiness. I knew almost nothing about him beyond the name Julian Hartwell and the whispers that followed it, a powerful, secretive businessman who owned restaurants, hotels, logistics companies, and held connections that people were too cautious to name aloud. Yet what haunted me wasn't what he owned, but the way he looked at me, as if I were part of a plan written long ago. finally arriving at the exact time it was meant to. The next morning, I woke before dawn, though I'd barely slept. The clock on the counter read 6:27. My hand rested on the handle of the suitcase I'd packed the night before. A part of me had already made the choice the moment I left his office. At 7 sharp, I arrived behind the restaurant. Just as instructed, Kevin met me with a look of mild surprise. But he didn't ask questions. He must have been told in advance. A black SUV waited nearby. The driver in a long coat, silent as he opened the door for me. I climbed in, trying to look composed, though my heart felt unsteady. As we left the city, the skyline of Chicago receded in the rearview mirror, its lights dissolving into the morning haze. At the private airport, I was escorted straight onto the tarmac, where a sleek white jet bearing a discreet Hartwell insignia gleamed against the gray sky. I climbed the steps slowly, as though crossing into another world. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of lavender. Cream-colored leather seats, walnut panels, soft lighting. Everything was calm, deliberate, hushed. Julian was already seated at the far end, holding a tablet, dressed neatly but more simply than the night before. He looked up as I entered and gave a small nod. "You're punctual. I appreciate that." I sat across from him and fastened my seatbelt, as instructed. The engines hummed, deep and steady, as the jet began to move. Once we were airborne, Julian leaned slightly toward me. "Do you know why I chose you?" he asked. I stayed silent, unafraid to guess. He opened a small drawer beside him and took out a silver-gray envelope, setting it on the table between us. He spoke slowly. "I once knew your grandmother, Edith Rhodes." My chest tightened. Back then, she was a librarian in Boston. I was just a boy who spent hours in the corner of that library, hiding from things I couldn't name at home. He paused, his gaze distant. "She taught me to pronounce a few Italian words. She used to give me books. I wasn't supposed to read books she'd slip into my hands when no one was looking. He never forgot her." I couldn't speak. The air seemed to still around us. Between two lives separated by time and circumstance, there was suddenly a thread fragile, invisible, yet undeniably real. Julian continued. "When I saw you, heard you speaking Italian on the phone, I knew. That tone, that quiet way of moving through a room, it reminded me of her." I opened the envelope. Inside was a round-trip ticket, a short itinerary, and an old photograph. My grandmother, smiling brightly, standing among bookshelves, her hand resting on the shoulder of a thin, dark-haired boy. Words failed me. "I'll be meeting a few Italian partners over the next 2 days," Julian said, his voice deep and deliberate. "But the real reason I asked you to come is because I owe your grandmother a debt, and I don't intend to repay it with money." The plane trembled gently as it passed through the clouds. Outside the window, the sky spread wide and pale gray. For the first time in months, I felt as though I wasn't running from my past. Maybe, somehow, I had just stepped back into it, only this time, on different terms. The flight lasted less than 2 hours. Yet it felt as though I had crossed from one world into another. When the plane descended onto the private airstrip outside Savannah, the sky was wrapped in a light mist, the sun veiled behind a silvery haze that hung over the old city like a gossamer curtain. I had never been to Georgia before, but I had read about Savannah in the books. My grandmother loved its cobblestone streets, the moss-draped oak trees bending over historic roofs, the air thick with the scent of time and secrets. A car was already waiting when we stepped off the plane. Julian said little. The driver, a man named Walter in his 50s, greeted me with a courteous nod and a kind, steady gaze. The car moved slowly through quiet streets lined with grand old houses, each adorned with wide porches and ivy-covered balconies. He sat still, half convinced I was dreaming. Julian remained calm beside me, occasionally taking a call in Italian, his voice deep, deliberate, and restrained. When the car turned through a pair of tall black iron gates, I held my breath. Before me stood a 3-story Georgian-style mansion, its ivory facade framed by dark green shutters. stone steps leading up to a broad veranda. It wasn't the kind of house owned by a modern tycoon. It was the kind that carried the breath of generations, every brick steeped in memory. I stepped out of the car. Julian went ahead, holding the door open for me. Inside, the house was elegant and hushed, with polished wooden floors, black and white photographs on the walls, and soft light spilling from vintage crystal chandeliers. A woman of Asian descent, perhaps in her early 40s, appeared from the kitchen, still wearing rubber gloves. "This is Dana, my housekeeper," Julian said. "She'll help you get settled." Dana nodded politely and led me upstairs to a small bedroom with a window overlooking the garden. On the bed sat a small suitcase and a few neatly folded outfits, carefully prepared. I turned to her, surprised. "I took your measurements from your employee ID at the restaurant," she said. "I hope they fit." I didn't know whether to feel uneasy or touched. Everything had been arranged with quiet precision, not ostentatious, but deliberate. I took a quick shower, changed into a simple beige silk dress, and went back downstairs. Julian was seated in the living room, reading a newspaper. When he saw me, he set it aside and rose. "There's a small gathering tonight," he said. "A few partners from Milan. Nothing formal, just dinner and conversation. But I'd like you to join." I nodded and sat in the chair beside him. The space between us filled with a comfortable silence, one that didn't demand to be broken. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his gaze lingering on the teacup in his hands. "Like I'm reading someone else's novel," I said softly. "And I'm the character who hasn't figured out where she's headed." He smiled faintly. "We rarely know where we are in the story until it's almost over." I looked at him, then really looked. And for the first time, the sense of caution slipped away. Beneath his composed exterior, there was a quiet weariness that made him seem achingly human, far from the powerful enigma whispered about in back rooms. "I still don't understand," I said after a pause. "Why me? You could have any interpreter, better ones." He was silent for a moment, then replied, "Because you're not like them. You don't try to prove anything. You're quiet. You listen. And those who listen in silence are the ones people trust the most." His answer left me wordless. Outside, the drizzle had begun, fine raindrops clinging to the window pane, shimmering in the lamplight. I knew, even before anything had happened, that this trip had already opened a new chapter. It wasn't just a job, not simply translation. It was an entry into a world veiled by calmness and bound together by unspoken ties. I didn't know what awaited me, only that the moment I stepped into this house, I had ceased to be the old Claire, and before me, Julian Hartwell was no longer a distant mystery, but a man slowly unlocking a door I had never dared to knock on. Julian was gone when I woke the next morning. On the kitchen table sat a steaming cup of black coffee in a delicate porcelain cup, and a small note written in his firm, precise handwriting. "The car will pick you up at 9. Dress warmly, the weather may turn colder today. J." Through the window, the morning light filtered softly through the oak trees that shaded the back garden. The air smelled of earth and dew, carrying that faint, unmistakable scent of the American South. When the car pulled away from the estate, Julian had not yet returned. Walter was behind the wheel, quiet as always, driving through tree-lined streets before turning down a narrow road that led to a nursing home, tucked behind an old brick wall covered in moss. The sign out front was simple, "Roads Home," and my chest tightened the moment I saw it. This was where my grandmother had lived for nearly 3 years, ever since her health began to fail, and she could no longer live alone. I called her often, but it had been more than a year since I'd seen her in person. As I entered the main hall, my hands trembled slightly. The air carried the mingled scent of antiseptic and faint peppermint tea. A young nurse greeted me and guided me down a long corridor where sunlight streamed through tall windows, spilling gold across the worn wooden floor. My grandmother's room was at the end. On the left, the door was slightly ajar. I drew a deep breath and gently pushed it open. She was lying on her side, silver hair soft against the pillow, her frail hands resting atop the blanket. The lamplight cast a gentle glow across her face, etched by years but still unmistakably hers, those same deep lows. Kind, knowing eyes that had always seen me. Claire, she whispered, her voice weak but clear. I hurried to her bedside and took her hand. It's me. Grandma. It's me. She smiled faintly, her eyes glimmering with tears. It's been so long since I've seen your face. But your voice, it still trembles a little. Like when you used to read poems to me as a child. I laughed softly, the ache in my throat rising. I'm sorry. I left you alone too long. She shook her head gently. No. Dear. I always knew you'd come back when it mattered most. I didn't understand what she meant. Not right away. Her grip tightened slightly, and then her gaze shifted toward the doorway. Has he told you yet? I turned to see Julian standing quietly at the threshold, a bouquet of pale lavender hydrangeas in his hand. He stepped inside and placed the flowers in a glass vase by the bed. She knows a little, he said softly, his tone different, now gentler, almost reverent in her presence. My grandmother nodded slowly. Julian was once a boy who sat in the corner of the city library, she said, her voice distant. Fond. He carried a sadness no one dared to ask about, except me. I was never afraid to ask. I looked at him then, and for the first time, saw something rare flicker behind his calm composure, a trace of humility, almost shyness. She taught me how to exist quietly, Julian said, his eyes meeting mine for a heartbeat. How to read the words that aren't on the page. And she's passed that gift on to you. My grandmother's hand tightened around mine again, her skin paper-thin but strong with intent. Claire, she whispered, there are things I can't explain, but you must trust your instincts. You've always had a way of finding light even in the dark. I sat with her for a long while, listening as she drifted in and out of stories of her youth, of my grandfather, of the men who came and went through the library, with eyes full of sorrow, and of the boy named Julian to whom she once slipped a forbidden book under his pillow, just to make sure he would come back. When the afternoon light poured through the window, she had fallen asleep, her lips still moving faintly as if in prayer. I rose quietly and left the room. Julian was waiting in the corridor, his gaze distant, fixed not on me but on the far end, where an old piano sat beneath a white curtain. Do you understand why I chose you now? He asked without turning around. I nodded, though he couldn't see it. Some choices don't need reasons. They only need to feel right. And in that moment, I knew that a door in my life had just opened, quietly and irreversibly. That evening, Savannah's air was soft and mild, but the weight of seeing my grandmother lingered quietly inside me. The feeling didn't fade, it threaded through every step, every breath, like a thin veil of mist that followed me back to the mansion. When I entered the grand hall, Dana was waiting with a small box in her hands. She handed it to me with a faint smile and a silent nod. Inside lay a long, deep blue evening gown, simple yet elegant, the fabric smooth as water slipping through my fingers. There was no note, but I understood. It was an invitation I couldn't refuse. An hour later, when I descended the staircase, Julian was already standing by the front door in a dark suit and a smoke-gray tie, loosely knotted. He turned at the sound of my steps, his eyes sweeping over me once. No words. No compliment, but that look was enough to tell me I had met his unspoken expectations. The car took us to a refined restaurant tucked within Savannah's historic quarter. Warm amber light spilled through the glass windows, glinting off the cobblestone street outside. The host bowed slightly to Julian and led us to a private dining room behind a curtain of deep red velvet. Inside, 3 men were already seated, sipping wine. They rose as we entered, greeting Julian with firm handshakes before their gazes turned to me curious. Assessing, Julian introduced me briefly in Italian. I caught every nuance of his tone, every deliberate pause. The eldest among them was Giancarlo Moretti, who owned a large logistics company in northern Italy. The other 2, Luca and Matteo, were twin brothers and co-CEOs of a maritime transport firm. Julian motioned for me to sit beside him, across from Giancarlo. Throughout dinner, I played the part of interpreter, but not merely repeating words. I had to sense what lingered between them. The hesitation beneath politeness, the careful phrasing, the subtle tests hidden in their remarks. Giancarlo spoke the most. He seemed to be probing Julian. Measuring him, they began with safe topics: the U.S. market, the rising costs of logistics, the need for more reliable partners at the Port of New Orleans. I translated in full, keeping the tone exact, preserving the rhythm of respect. Julian listened, occasionally nodding or offering a concise reply, but mostly letting me steer the pace of the exchange. The air around the table was formal at first, yet tension began to build with every glass of wine poured. Luca and Matteo exchanged fleeting glances, small but telling, as if sharing an unspoken secret. And then came the moment the game truly began. Giancarlo poured himself another glass, speaking casually about past betrayals partners who had leaked confidential information to the authorities in Milan. He looked directly at me as he said it, his tone deceptively light, like a fisherman tossing bait into still water to see what would rise. I translated the sentence, my face composed. Though my pulse quickened, Julian remained calm, taking a slow sip of his wine before answering in measured Italian, every syllable sharp and deliberate. If you didn't trust me, you wouldn't be sitting here. I translated, holding Giancarlo's gaze as I did. He smiled thinly, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. I felt Julian lean slightly toward me, his voice a low murmur that only I could hear. Do you see what they're testing for? I nodded almost imperceptibly and whispered back in Italian. They want to know if you have a weakness. He lifted an eyebrow, a faint flicker of approval passing through his eyes, not because I'd understood the situation, but because I dared to name it aloud. The conversation continued, but the politeness was gone. It had become a chess match. Each word, each pause, each glass refilled was a move across a board of power and perception. I became the rhythm between them, the bridge, the silent witness to a negotiation built not on signatures but on trust and leverage. Near the end of the meal, as the dessert plates were set down, Giancarlo turned to me suddenly and asked, if you had to choose your loyalty to the man who employs you, or to what is right, what would you choose? I looked at him for a long moment, then translated the question into English, without omitting a single word. Julian's gaze memin, steady and unreadable. You don't need to answer, he said quietly. That question says more about them than it ever could about you. When we left the restaurant, none of us spoke. On the drive back, Julian stared out the window, one arm resting along the door, the city lights gliding across his face like faint ripples of gold. I didn't break the silence, but I knew, as the car carried us through the quiet streets, that my role had shifted. I was no longer merely a translator. I had stepped into the center of a much larger board, where every word I spoke could stir unseen currents, and every glance I received was another test in a game whose rules I had yet to fully understand. The next morning, a soft rain fell over Savannah, fine as strands of silver brushing against the window of the room where I woke, caught somewhere between unease and curiosity. The meeting from the night before lingered in my mind with haunting clarity. The glances, the measured words, the silences that seemed to carry more weight than speech itself. I dressed in a cream turtleneck sweater and pale gray trousers, then went downstairs. Julian was already in the study. Before him stretched a long table covered in documents, logistics maps, and printed surveillance photos. He didn't look up when I entered, but his voice came just as I was about to speak. Did you sleep well? I nodded and stepped closer. Several of the papers were marked with red ink. Julian tapped a finger on a shipment manifest, circling one particular line. I leaned in, scanning the Italian text. The listed cargo was mechanical components. Destination, New Orleans. But Julian pointed to the transport code. This code doesn't exist in my system, he said quietly. I checked 3 times. Then he slid a photograph toward me, a container being unloaded in the dead of night. Its registration obscured. His voice remained calm, but his eyes had the alert, precise gleam of someone piecing together a puzzle. I began to understand. The negotiations last night hadn't been about legitimate trade. They were a facade for something far more dangerous. A smuggling route that Giancarlo's group was trying to weave into Julian's supply network. Whether it was weapons or contraband, I didn't know. But it was certainly not the harmless components they claimed. I asked him why he hadn't refused them outright. Julian leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment, as if weighing how much truth to share. Because if I shut the door immediately, they'll retreat into the shadows and I'll lose them. I need them to believe I'm still listening. Still undecided. Sometimes silence, he said, is the most sophisticated trap of all. I nodded, finally beginning to see why I was here. Not for my language skills, but because I was the only outsider he could trust, the one person not bound to any power structure or allegiance. Julian rested his hand on another folder. I want you with me this afternoon, he said. They're coming here. I'm about to make a move they won't expect. I didn't ask what kind. I simply nodded. That afternoon, the 3 men arrived right on time. This time there was no wine, no dinner, only the quiet formality of a drawing room whose windows looked out onto the damp garden beyond. Julian awaited them with a single folder laid neatly before him. I sat beside him, ready to translate whatever was necessary. Giancarlo opened with an amiable tone, referencing their talk from the night before, and asked whether Julian had reached a decision. Julian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the folder to a single page. This is my customs inspection report, he said evenly. The containers you mentioned never passed through thermal scanning. And this, he slid a satellite image across the table, shows your shipment being unloaded at 3:18 in the morning, with no one present at the checkpoint. His voice didn't rise, but every word sliced cleanly through the still air of the room. Giancarlo said nothing. Luca and Matteo exchanged a quick, panicked glance. I translated Julian's words exactly as they were, each syllable landing like a verdict. Julian leaned back slightly, eyes sharp, unreadable. If this is how you do business, he said, then I was mistaken to think we could work together. I'm not naive, but I don't partner with men who play with hidden cards. You said you don't trust others. Now I have my own reasons not to trust you. Giancarlo forced a smile, claiming it must be a clerical error, that they'd look into it. Julian didn't return the smile. He gave only a brief nod, then rose to his feet slowly, deliberately, with finality. The meeting ended there. When they left, none of them said goodbye. I remained seated. Heart pounding, Julian turned to me, his expression cool, almost amused. You just witnessed a table flip, Claire, he said, and the real game has only begun. I didn't answer, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was already in too deep to turn back. And perhaps, I realized with a shiver of something I couldn't quite name, I didn't want to. 2 days after the failed negotiation, the mansion seemed to fall into an unnatural calm. Julian never mentioned what had happened, nor did he show any sign of concern. He worked in the library as usual, while I spent most of my time reading by the upstairs window or sitting quietly in the garden behind the house. Yet the silence unsettled me. It felt like the pause in a symphony just before the drums begin, a stillness so brief, yet sharp enough to make one hold their breath. On Saturday morning, Julian took me to a small art gallery in downtown Savannah. He was sponsoring a solo exhibition for an Italian artist. The air inside smelled faintly of pinewood and fresh ink. The walls were covered with bold, abstract canvases, the colors vivid against the cold gray of the cement floor. I stood beside Julian, pretending to understand the wild brushstrokes before us. While he conversed fluently in Italian with a group of collectors and art representatives, I wasn't there to translate this time. He wanted me simply to be present, a quiet detail in the tableau he was painting for the world. As the crowd grew, the hum of laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the gallery. That was when I noticed something wrong. A man standing in the corner pulled out his phone, muttered something quickly, then slipped through the back door. Minutes later, the sharp sound of shoes striking concrete echoed through the room. 4 men entered plain clothes. No badges. but their posture and faces told me immediately they were not here for the art. One of them flashed an identification card and spoke firmly to Julian. "Sir, you'll need to come with us immediately to clarify a few issues regarding international shipments." The room froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Julian didn't move. His eyes flicked toward me for a single, fleeting second before returning to the man in front of him. I stood motionless, my heart hammering, unsure what to do. But Julian didn't hesitate. In that instant, he gave me the slightest nod, so subtle it might have been a trick of the light. Then, without warning, he turned sharply, shoved the nearest man aside, and bolted toward the stairway leading to the gallery's basement. Everything erupted at once. The men shouted, drawing weapons from beneath their coats. I reacted on instinct, darting toward a narrow side corridor where I glimpsed an emergency door half open. Outside, the alley reeked of garbage and cigarette smoke. I ran, not knowing where I was going. Seconds later, a hand caught my arm and pulled me back. It was Julian. He stood beside a silver-gray car idling near the wall. The back door was already open, and behind the wheel sat Walter, his face composed. Eyes steady. I climbed into the back seat, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the rain against the roof. Julian slammed the door shut, and the car sped off, tires screeching against the wet pavement. He said nothing, staring straight ahead, every muscle in his jaw tight as wire. For several minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic swish of the wipers. Then, as we left the city behind, he finally spoke. They moved faster than I expected. Someone in Giancarlo's group broke ranks, leaked false information. They wanted to strip me of leverage. I struggled to catch my breath. What about the people in the gallery? He shook his head. They weren't there to arrest me. It was theater to rattle me, to force my hand. But by walking out, I've made my choice. There's no going back now. Outside, the trees blurred past, streaked with rain like ink bleeding across watercolor paper. Inside, something shifted within me. The fear that had once filled me was replaced by an unnerving clarity, cold and absolute. Everything from this moment on had changed. There would be no more staged negotiations. No more cautious tests or veiled intentions. The game had truly begun, and whether I wanted it or not, I was already at the center of the board. The flight from Savannah was hurried and wordless. Walter drove us to the private airstrip under the cover of night, neither of us speaking during the entire ride. When the plane's wheels finally touched down on the snow-dusted runway in Aspen, I felt the shift immediately. Gone was the humid stillness of the South, replaced by air so cold and pure it seemed to cut through skin. Sharp and clean, scented faintly of pine and freshly fallen snow. I had never been to Colorado, much less Aspen, a place I only knew from glossy travel books and photographs of lives that never looked real. But Julian, it was clear, belonged here. A black SUV was waiting on the tarmac, this time with a new driver, an older man named Bill, his voice carrying the rugged calm of someone who'd spent his life in the mountains. We drove slowly along winding, empty roads. Houses grew scarcer the higher we climbed. When we stopped, I saw it, a wooden cabin nestled deep among the pines, its roof blanketed with snow, a faint amber light glowing from the windows like a quiet promise of warmth in the freezing dark. Inside, the place couldn't have been more different from the mansion in Savannah. No polished marble, no antique, no echoes of wealth. Just dark wooden floors, high ceilings, a crackling fire in the hearth, and shelves lined with books worn soft at the edges. I felt as though I had stepped into Julian's private world, the one he kept hidden, untouched by business, power, or suspicion. He didn't speak much. He simply made 2 mugs of hot cocoa, handed me one, and sat beside the fire. For a long time, we stayed in silence, the flames painting amber light across his face, highlighting both strength and exhaustion. He leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on the fire. "You want to know who I am, don't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. Julian took a sip of cocoa before setting the cup down. "My father was Italian. My mother. American. I was born in Milan but spent most of my life in Boston. My father worked for an organization I later learned was a financial syndicate legal on the surface, but designed to control everything it touched. When I was 11, he was killed in a car crash. The police called unexplained. My mother, she couldn't recover. She died 2 years later. His voice was low, steady, but each word carried a gravity that filled the room. After that, I lived with relatives. I learned to survive by staying silent. I watched everything. I noticed things no one thought I saw. I wanted to be a writer once, he said, a faint smile ghosting his lips. Or maybe a teacher. But life doesn't always honor what we imagine on paper. Instead, I was taught to run a company, to talk to politicians and smugglers alike, to know who was loyal and who would sell you out, and most importantly, to exist in a world where the rules are written by those powerful enough to break them. He turned to me then, his eyes softer now. Your grandmother was the only person who ever told me I didn't have to be the product of my past, that I could choose to rewrite my own story. I didn't believe her for a long time. He paused. Not until I met you. I didn't know what to say. My chest felt tight. My thoughts tangled in a web of sympathy, fear, admiration, and something else, something wordless and fragile that glowed faintly like a spark in the cold. I realized he had just revealed to me the one part of himself the world would never see, not Julian Hartwell. The powerful name whispered in boardrooms and rumors. But Julian, the man scarred, searching, and quietly desperate to reclaim the piece of humanity that had been taken from him. I didn't speak. I simply watched the fire, letting the crackle and hiss of burning wood fill the silence between us. Perhaps sometimes people don't need answers, only the presence of someone willing to stay beside them without asking for any. And that night, in the frozen quiet of Aspen, I began to understand why I was still there. Not for the promise, not for the money, not even for my grandmother. I stayed because of him. Snow had been falling all day, soft, steady, and unhurried, like a wordless symphony wrapping the forest outside the cabin in white. By evening, the sky had deepened into a somber shade of blue-gray, and the only light came from the fire burning in the hearth, casting a warm amber glow that danced across the wooden walls. I sat curled up on the sofa, hands wrapped around a cup of ginger tea, eyes drifting toward the window where the world had vanished beneath snow and silence. Julian entered the room without a sound. He had changed into a dark brown sweater, his hair still damp from the shower. Sitting across from me, he picked up a book, though I could tell from the stillness of his fingers that he wasn't reading. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Only the soft crackle of burning wood broke the quiet. I turned slightly, about to say something, when I caught him looking at me not with intensity or hesitation, but with the kind of gaze that holds steady because it's too honest to look away. My pulse slowed, and the noise inside my mind faded until all that was left was the quiet between us. I wanted to ask him something, though I couldn't yet find the words. He was the one who broke the silence first. Claire, he said softly, have you ever felt like you were standing on a threshold, and you knew that if you took just one more step, there would be no way back? I nodded faintly, my voice barely above a whisper. I think I've been there more than once. But this time, it feels like I'm closer to the edge than ever. Julian set the book down and leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the fire instead of me, as if confessing to the flames rather than to another person. I've lost too many people by believing that distance was the only way to protect them, he said quietly. I thought keeping the world at arm's length was strength, but I've begun to understand it isn't love that weakens us. It's the fear of admitting it. Something in my chest tightened. He turned to me then, and his eyes were completely unguarded. You've made me see the parts of myself I tried to deny. I didn't plan for this to happen, not here. Not now. Not with anyone who stumbled into my life by chance. But you weren't a coincidence. Claire, the moment I heard you speak Italian that night in the restaurant, I knew. I didn't know I would fall for you, but I knew you would change something in me. I didn't know how to respond. My heart pounded hard against my ribs. Not out of fear, but because this was the first time I had ever seen him stripped of all his defenses. No strategy. No pretense. No control. I'm not someone who trusts easily. Julian, I said quietly, I've been hurt before by words that sounded beautiful but meant nothing. He nodded, his eyes steady on mine. Then don't believe my words, he said softly. Believe what I do from this moment on. I sat there for a breath that felt like forever, then slowly set my cup down and crossed the small distance between us. The air between us vanished, no table. No sofa. No safe space left to hide. I placed my hand over his, warm from the fire. I don't know what happens after tonight, I said, but I know this is real, and I'm not afraid of it anymore. Julian didn't answer. He simply closed his fingers around mine and held on firm. Wordless. Certain. In that silence. Without promises. Without definitions. Something deeper than love passed between us. Something only those who have known loss and loneliness can truly understand, that the most frightening thing isn't crossing the line, it's standing forever on this side of it. Convincing yourself you're fine. The snow had stopped by morning. The sky had cleared, and sunlight filtered through the pine branches, heavy with white, turning the world outside the cabin into a still life painting, quiet, pristine, and unreal. I woke with a feeling both strange and familiar. Not because of where I was, but because of who was there. Julian stood by the fireplace, holding an old envelope, the paper faded to a pale yellow, the edges softened by time, like something that had been hidden away for years. When I approached, he turned, his expression calm, though there was a gravity behind his composure that I could almost feel in the air. This is something I think you should see, he said, handing me the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, the ink slightly blurred in places, the handwriting strong and deliberate, the kind of hand that belonged to a man used to wielding words as weapons. The letter was signed, James E. Rhodes. My breath caught. It was the name of my grandfather, the man I knew only from faded black and white photographs and fragments of stories my grandmother Edith used to tell. The letter wasn't long, but every word pulled me backward into a past I had never truly entered. In it, my grandfather wrote about a period in the early 1970s when he had worked as a financial advisor to a group of Italian businessmen expanding their operations to the U.S. East Coast. One of them was Carlo Hartwell, Julian's father. My grandfather had warned Carlo about laundering money through a network of restaurants and shipping companies, but Carlo hadn't listened. He wrote that the two men had shared something complex, part friendship, part rivalry, bound by ideals that eventually diverged. When my grandfather realized how deeply Carlo had sunk into the underworld, he could no longer stay silent. He withdrew, but before leaving, to protect Edith and their daughter, my mother, he placed a copy of documents exposing Carlo's crimes in a private safety deposit box at a Boston bank. The last lines of the letter read, I hope that one day, if Julian is strong enough to see beyond the sins of his bloodline, he will learn the truth from the other side, not through vengeance, but through understanding. I sat motionless in the warm cabin, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. Julian said nothing, waiting for me to take it all in. Finally, I lifted my gaze, my voice hoarse. How did you get this? He came closer, sitting beside me. Your grandmother sent it to me a month before she moved into the nursing home, he said quietly. She told me I'd need it when I was ready to choose a path different from my father's proda, and she said the only person besides me who had the right to read it was you. I set the letter down, though my hands still shook. Questions swirled in my mind like a blizzard outside the window. Then, your father's death, it wasn't really an accident, was it? Julian's gaze dropped, his voice low and deliberate. No, it was an internal purge. When he began to weaken, others in the network wanted him out of the way. I know who did it, but I never took revenge. I chose to rebuild from the wreckage he left behind. I looked at him for a long time, my heart tightening with a strange, wordless ache. Between us now lay more than affection, more than shared escape and danger. Between us was history, the shadow of two families, 2 generations bound by choices that had rippled forward to shape us both. I didn't know what hurt more, learning that my grandfather had once lived inside a world of hidden risks, or realizing that Julian's father had died because of the very decisions my grandfather had tried to stop. But in that moment, I understood we were both survivors of a battlefield neither of us had chosen. Julian reached out, his hand brushing mine so gently, it might have been a breath. He didn't speak. He didn't try to comfort or explain. We simply sat there together, surrounded by the weight of things we could never change, but with the quiet understanding that we could decide how the story would end. And I knew then that what bound us was no longer something fragile or new. It was something forged in loss, shaped by truth, and sustained by trust, fragile yet real enough for 2 people who had walked through darkness to finally, quietly, choose the light together. Julian left Aspen early the next morning for a closed-door meeting in Denver. He didn't share details, only said a branch of the old network was showing signs of reawakening, and he had to cut it off at the root. I stayed behind at the cabin with Bill, the quiet, deliberate driver whose caution bordered on instinct. The air felt stretched thin, as though the silence itself were waiting for something to break. That afternoon, while I sat in the reading room, Bill appeared with a phone in hand. "Someone wants to meet you," he said. "Not through Julian. He claims you're the only one who'll understand what he has to say." I studied him carefully, searching for a hint of deception, but his expression was the same as always, steady, respectful, and unreadable. The man's name was Clint Maddox. The moment I heard it, my body went cold. I'd seen that name once before in an old news clipping about the so-called accident that killed Carlo Hartwell, Julian's father. Maddox had been mentioned briefly as a witness, a shipping executive who had handled Carlo's final freight contracts. I nodded. Bill drove me down into town to a small coffee shop tucked against the side of a mountain. Clint Maddox was already there, tall, broad-shouldered, his silver hair combed neatly back. The kind of man who still dressed as if appearances could hold the world together. When I entered, he rose to shake my hand, his eyes sharp and measuring, the kind of gaze that seems to strip a person down to truth. "You look like your mother," he said, his voice rough from years of smoke. "But your eyes, those are James Rhodes's eyes." I sat, keeping my tone even. "What do you want?" A faint smile crossed his lips. "Want nothing, Claire. I just think it's time someone from both families knew the whole story. I didn't kill Carlo Hartwell, but I know who did. And why?" He spoke without pause, without flinching. "After James Rhodes pulled out of the operation," he said, a vacuum opened. Carlo was under pressure on all sides, desperate to legitimize enormous cash flows before federal scrutiny caught up. Maddox was the intermediary, managing shipments, so no single person knew the entire route. But Carlo grew suspicious, convinced Maddox was planning to turn against him. Quiet investigations began. Then came the purges. Maddox escaped, just in time. The man who actually ordered Carlo's death, he said, was Luca Ferrero, one of the 3 men Julian and I had met in Savannah. He slid a thick envelope across the table. "These are copies of Ferrero's freight manifests," he said. "Look closely, the duplicate codes. The containers that never reached their ports." I stared at him, unable to hide my distrust. "Why give this to me?" "Because Julian won't believe anyone from the old network," Maddox said simply. "But he'll listen to you. And if Ferrero resurfaces, he won't stop at threats. He wants to rebuild the old line and erase everyone who can expose him." He stood then, slowly pulling on his coat. "I'm not looking for forgiveness. I was never one of the good men. But some things need to end before they start again. And endings don't always come from the strongest, they come from the ones who dare to speak." When I returned to the cabin, Julian was already there, standing in the shadows of the hallway, his gaze fixed on the folder in my hands. He didn't ask who'd given it to me. "I thought it would take years to find this," he said quietly. He sat down and began to read. His expression never changed, but the tension in his grip betrayed the storm underneath. When he reached the final page, he lifted his head. "Do you understand what giving this to me means?" I met his eyes and nodded without hesitation. "It means there's no turning back now." Julian gave a single, Deliberate nod. The calm businessman was gone. In his place stood a man staring down the choice that would define the rest of his life. And in that instant, I knew the enemy had a name, and the real war had begun. That night, after Julian had fallen asleep, I stepped out onto the cabin porch, pulling my wool sweater tightly around me as I sank into the old wooden chair facing the snow-covered forest. The air bit sharply at my skin, but my thoughts burned hot, feverish, and relentless. In less than a month, my entire life had been turned upside down. I had gone from being a restaurant waitress trying to hold together the fractured pieces of my past to someone carrying the secret that could determine the fate of two families, someone standing beside a man who was both dangerous and kind, someone who frightened me and made me believe at the same time. But that belief now was being tested harder than ever. I could follow Julian into his coming confrontation with Ferrero and the network that lived beneath the law, where survival had nothing to do with justice once lines were crossed. Or I could walk away, cut ties, disappear, return to New York, and start over again, just as I had once done after leaving Boston. A voice in my head kept whispering that I had already escaped once from the things that made me lose control. And now, here I was, walking straight into something far more perilous. I thought of my mother, who had once borne her silence to protect me from the parts of the truth she thought were too heavy for a child to carry. I thought of my grandmother Edith, the calm certainty in her eyes the last time I saw her, as if she had always known I would choose what was right, even if right wasn't easy. But what if right didn't mean safe? What if it meant stepping into a world that didn't belong to me, and never would, out beyond the porch? Faint lights flickered in the distance. Maybe another cabin. Maybe something else, but to me, they looked like two paths splitting open inside my mind. One was quiet, detached, peaceful. The other was Julian, the truth, the unknown, and everything unresolved. I didn't know if I was strong enough to see it through. I didn't know if I was brave enough to accept that my life from this point on would never again be simple. But I did know this: if I turned away now, I would carry the weight of that choice for the rest of my life. Not because I'd be abandoning Julian, but because I'd be abandoning the part of myself that had finally found the courage to exist. I thought of the first time I met him, when I knew nothing beyond a name and a gaze that saw too much. I thought of how he told me I wasn't an accident, that from the very beginning, he had trusted me to see what others couldn't. And in that moment, I understood if I walked away, I wouldn't just lose him, I would lose the best version of myself, the one I had only just begun to recognize in his presence. I sat there until the edge of night began to pale, until the snow caught the first faint glimmer of dawn, and the world turned silver blue with morning. Then I stood, went back inside the cabin, and slipped into the room where Julian lay sleeping. His breathing was steady, calm, unguarded. I didn't wake him. I simply slid beneath the blanket, close enough to feel the warmth of him, and placed my hand over his chest, where his heartbeat thudded slow and certain. In that moment, I stopped thinking about what choice I would make, because by not leaving, I already had. And whatever came after, whatever it cost, that choice was the only one I could live with and never regret. We left Aspen 3 days later, when word came through Julian's network that Ferrero had begun moving again quietly, back toward Europe. Julian needed time to gather proof before striking, and I had only one wish left in me then: to see Edith. She was living in a small nursing home on the outskirts of Charleston, where the air still carried a trace of sea salt, and the afternoons smelled faintly of sun-warmed magnolia. When I walked into her room for the first time in months, I almost didn't recognize her. She was smaller, her skin translucent as paper. Her eyes, once bright and mischievous, had sunk deep into shadows. But when she saw me, a spark flickered there, like a candle flaring one last time before the wick gave out. "Claire," she whispered, her voice as thin as air. "You came back." I took her hand, feeling every fragile bone beneath the cold skin. "I'm here, Grandma. I'm home." The days that followed unfolded slowly, like a worn classical record playing its final track. Each morning, I came with books, cinnamon cookies she used to love, and a small thermos of Earl Grey tea brewed just the way she'd taught me as a child. She didn't speak much, but every time I read aloud, she would smile faintly and close her eyes, as if the sound of my voice warmed the corners of her memory that had begun to fade. Julienne came too, hesitant at first, but she welcomed him with a rare, gentle smile. "I knew you'd return," she told him, her tone playful but tired. "I wasn't sure you deserved her back then, but now, I think you're finding your way." Julian laughed quietly. I cried instead. That afternoon, I wheeled her out into the small garden behind the home. She asked me not to talk, only to sit with her, to listen to the wind moving through the lavender. I did, and in that stillness, I felt small again, like the little girl who used to sit cross-legged at her feet, listening to fairy tales I would later realize were pieces of her own life, softened into stories for me to believe in. One evening, as I was preparing to leave, she called me back and slipped a sealed envelope into my hand. "Not yet," she whispered. "Read it when it's all over, when you're ready for the next chapter." I tucked it into my coat pocket without a word. That was her way. She never gave answers, only keys, and trusted me to find the doors myself. The next morning, her breathing weakened. The doctor said it might be a matter of days. I called Julian. He arrived within 3 hours and sat beside her without speaking, holding her hand for what felt like forever. When she opened her eyes again and saw him, she gave a faint nod, an unspoken blessing, quiet and final. Then she turned to me. Her voice was barely a breath. "Live fully. Claire, not for me, but for you. Let love lead, not fear." That night, she was gone, peaceful, as if a bird that had flown long enough finally chose the right moment to rest. I didn't cry, not right away. I sat beside her, still holding her hand, listening as the last echo of her heartbeat slipped into the silence like a farewell too deep for words. Those final days weren't just an ending. They were a mirror showing me the arc of my life, so far from the woman who ran from her past to the one now brave enough to face truth and love head on. Edith hadn't simply raised me. She had rooted me, shaped me, and left her light inside me. When I stepped out of the nursing home, the letter still unopened in my hand, I felt the evening sun touch my face, and in that golden light clinging to the wooden porch rail, I knew I wasn't alone, because she was still here with me, soft as twilight, steady as love that refuses to fade. No matter how long the night becomes, Julian sat beside me through the entire last night of Edith's life. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even leave the room once. He didn't need to. His presence alone, quiet, steady, unwavering, was the only thing that kept me tethered to the moment while everything inside me threatened to shatter. His hand clasped mine like an anchor in a storm I couldn't control. When Edith took her final breath, there wasn't any sound I could truly hear, only a sudden stillness. A depth of silence so profound it felt as if time itself had paused to mourn her passing. I had imagined I would scream, collapse, or lose myself completely, but I didn't. I simply sat there, one hand still wrapped around hers, the other held tightly in Julian's. Somehow, his calm steadiness allowed me to survive that moment, without being swept away by it. Julian rose first. He leaned over, gently closed Edith's clouded eyes, and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. He said nothing, yet there was reverence in the gesture, an unspoken gratitude, a farewell offered to a woman he'd come to respect as if she were his own. When he turned back to me, there was a tenderness in his gaze I had never seen before. He didn't try to console me, didn't offer any of the usual phrases people use to fill silence. Instead, he sat down on the floor beside my chair, resting his head lightly against my knees. We stayed that way for nearly an hour, until a nurse came in and gently asked us to step out so they could begin the final preparations. When I tried to stand, my legs wouldn't obey. Julian caught me, held me close, an embrace that needed no words, no reason, only the raw truth of two people who had just shared an unthinkable loss. By the time we stepped into the corridor, dawn was beginning to break. Light filtered through the long hallway, thin and fragile, but it was light all the same, reminding us that even grief couldn't stop mourning from coming. Julian guided me out to the small garden behind the facility, the same one where I had wheeled Edith the day before. We sat on a wooden bench. He handed me a paper cup of coffee from a vending machine, lukewarm. Bitter, but warm enough to hold. She lived a full life, he said quietly, watching the lavender bend beneath the morning breeze. Not everyone gets that. She loved. She lost. She forgave. And she left something behind. You're proof of that. I stared at him, my throat tight, eyes burning but dry. I'm scared. Julian. I'm scared that if I keep living through things this big, I'll lose the softer parts of myself. He turned to me, silent for a moment. Then, with a voice calm and certain, he said, "But if you don't live for the things that matter, that softness won't mean anything. It'll fade." This, he placed his hand over my chest. Right above my heart. This doesn't have to be strong. It just has to be real. And you're real. Claire. That was when I finally broke. Not from pain, but from being seen so clearly. I cried into his shoulder, my tears soaking through his shirt. Julian didn't try to hush me or fix me. He just held me, letting me grieve until there was nothing left but breath. When I finally looked up, his own eyes were wet, not out of weakness, but from the depth of understanding that only shared sorrow can bring. We stayed at the nursing home until late afternoon, taking care of every detail of the funeral. Julian managed everything with a quiet dedication that humbled me, his voice low and measured as he spoke with staff. His movements precise. Gentle. He did it not out of duty, but because he wanted to, because he cared for me. And for Edith, that night, we returned to a small seaside hotel. I couldn't sleep. I lay beside him, listening to the faint rhythm of the waves breaking against the shore, thinking of Edith's final words, "Live fully." I didn't yet know how to do that, but I knew I would no longer have to learn it alone. Because now, I had him. And when Julian's fingers found mine in the soft darkness of that quiet room by the sea, I understood more clearly than ever. He wasn't just staying because I needed him. He was staying because he'd chosen to. The morning of Edith's funeral dawned under a soft Charleston rain. Fine threads of drizzle fell through the golden leaves of the maples, cloaking the air in a quiet, melancholy gentle, but heavy enough that everyone instinctively bowed their heads as they entered the small cemetery beside the old church. I wore a simple black dress, no makeup. No perfume. Julian held my hand from the moment we left the hotel until we stood before the velvet-draped headstone, as if he knew that if he let go, I might fall apart. There were no more than 30 people present, mostly old neighbors, a few of Edith's friends from the nursing home, and several retired librarians who had once volunteered with her. None of them knew what I had become, how far life had carried me, but all of them remembered her with that same quiet reverence, the kind reserved for someone whose kindness had shaped more lives than she ever realized. The pastor's words were simple yet piercing. When the trumpet began to play Amazing Grace, I couldn't hold back my tears. Julian said nothing. He only handed me a handkerchief, a beige one with lace edges. I recognized it immediately. It was Edith's. He must have kept it without telling me. A small, wordless gesture of care. After the final blessing, people came to offer condolences and drifted away one by one, until only Julian and I remained. The ground was still damp beneath our feet, freshly turned earth darkening under the drizzle. I knelt and laid a small bundle of dried lavender on the grave, the flower she had loved. The scent, she always said, brought her peace. When I stood, Julian's hand found my shoulder. He turned me gently toward him, his eyes searching mine, with a look that held both hesitation and resolve. "Claire," he said softly, "there's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time, but I kept waiting for the right moment. Standing here, beside the woman who raised you, who taught you to be the person you are, I know I can't wait any longer." My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Julian's voice dropped to a near whisper, each word deliberate, as if it came from somewhere deep and long-guarded. "I didn't know what love was until I met you, not because you pulled me out of my past, but because you made me believe the future could be different. You didn't have to change me or save me, you just had to be. You did something no one else ever. You made me want to step out from my father's shadow. Tears blurred my vision. And in that moment, under the cold rain and the muted gray of morning, Julian no longer seemed like the powerful, mysterious man who had once terrified half of Chicago. He was simply a man unshielded, honest, and heartbreakingly human. I stepped closer and wrapped my arms around him. I don't know what to do with all this loss, I whispered. But if you're still here, if you don't leave, I think I'll be okay. Julian held me tighter, his voice trembling against my ear. I'm not going anywhere. Not while you still need me. And not now that I've found something I spent my whole life thinking wasn't real. We stayed like that for a long time. The rain falling softly around us, steady and tender as a final farewell. And in that moment, at a graveside where life and death were separated by only a thin layer of earth, I understood something I had never fully known before. Love isn't born from sweetness alone. It's forged in the fire of loss, shaped by loyalty, and proven in the quiet courage to stay when everything else has fallen apart. 3 days after Edith's funeral, Julian's phone rang at 6 a.m. I heard it from the next room, the sharp tone slicing through the quiet, and then his footsteps pacing, firm but measured. When he came into my room, the first light of day was filtering through the white curtains, casting a pale shimmer across his face. But it wasn't the light that caught me, it was the look in his eyes. A tension I hadn't seen since the night in Aspen. It's Ferrero, he said quietly. He left Zurich under a false name, but he never reached his next destination. I sat up straight, my pulse quickening, caught somewhere between shock and disbelief. What do you mean? Julian's gaze met mine. He's gone. No trace, no signal, no travel record, no immigration log. It's as if he vanished from the world. That entire day, I watched Julian slip into a world I'd only glimpsed before, a web of encrypted calls, coded messages, and video meetings I wasn't allowed to join. His calm precision was unnerving, almost mechanical, but underneath it I sensed something else, an unease he didn't want me to see. That evening, he joined me on the hotel balcony, where the Atlantic spread out in a black, endless sheet beyond the railing. The wind carried the scent of rain and salt. Julian leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and began to speak. Ferrero exposed himself when he tried to move a large sum through a Swiss bank under an alias. He said, "One of my dormant surveillance teams caught it, something I set up years ago, only meant to activate in an emergency. The transfer triggered a chain reaction. His account was frozen. The identity flagged. And within 12 hours, his entire financial network collapsed. He was cornered." Julian's voice grew keener, colder. And when a man like Ferrero realizes he's being hunted, he doesn't wait to be caught. He disappears himself. I listened, my stomach tightening. Ferrero had always been more shadow than flesh. The kind of man who didn't die so much as vanish into rumor. Julian continued. Then I got a video sent from an anonymous source. It showed Ferrero sitting in a stone room, somewhere underground. It looked pale, trembling. He said only one thing. In old Italian. Julian paused, his jaw tightening. The promise of the past is the ending of the present. Then the screen flickered, and it went black. There was no violence on the recording, no sound beyond his voice, but Julian didn't need confirmation. "He's gone," he said softly. "Dead. Maybe. Or locked away where no one outside that circle will ever find him. Either way, the world will go on as if he never existed." I wanted to ask what he felt relief, justice, emptiness, but the words caught in my throat. He looked at me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. "I thought," he said finally, "that when Ferrero was gone, I'd feel something like victory, but all I feel is silence, like a door closing quietly at the end of a long, dark hallway. No applause, no closure, just an ending." I took his hand and held it, saying nothing. I understood. Not every enemy's fall brings freedom. Sometimes what remains is the hollow echo of everything lost along the way. And yet, Deep down, I knew this was the moment the curse broke. The shadow that had loomed over 2 generations was finally gone. It wasn't joy that came with it, but space, a fragile, trembling kind of peace, a beginning disguised as an ending. That night, we stayed on the balcony for hours, not speaking of what came next. The wind brushed against us like a whisper, and the sea kept its rhythm, steady and infinite. I thought of Edith, of James Rhodes, of Carlo Hartwell, all the souls who had carried burdens too heavy to live freely, and I knew there was still much to do. But for now, at least, one ghost had been laid to rest, and for the first time in years, I watched Julian exhale not as a man escaping danger, but as one finally released from a promise that had haunted him all his life. We left Charleston a week after Ferrero's disappearance. Julian didn't explain much, just said he needed to go somewhere far. Not for business, not to chase ghosts, but simply to breathe. I agreed, because I knew he needed that space. And maybe, so did I. A small plane carried us west to Napa Valley, California. On a late afternoon, painted in soft light, the air was clear, the sun gentle, and the scent of wine and lavender rolled through the hills like a balm over the wounds. Neither of us had fully healed. We stayed in a small villa surrounded by vineyards, a place frozen in time. From the brass door handles to the creaking wooden swing on the porch, every morning, Julian woke early, brewed coffee, and sat outside with a book while I lingered beneath the blankets, half asleep and half listening to the rustle of leaves. Every evening, we walked among the vines, our silence comfortable, our hands brushing occasionally like 2 strangers who had somehow found peace in each other after surviving a storm too long. One night, after a dinner of toasted bread, cheese, and red wine, Julian asked me to change. He wanted to take me somewhere special. He said. I didn't ask where, just slipped into an ivory silk dress, tied my hair loosely, and followed him with a quiet heart, unaware that it was about to be set, trembling in the most unexpected way. He drove us up a hill overlooking the valley, where the last light of sunset pooled between the rows of vines. Tiny lights flickered along the path, leading to a wooden arbor draped in white blossoms. The view was breathtaking, gold fading into violet. The world hushed in a kind of sacred calm. I turned to say something, but Julian had already taken both of my hands in his. His voice was steady, but soft. Claire, I don't know how to begin this. I only know there hasn't been a single day. I haven't been grateful that you didn't walk away when everything went dark. You were the only light that showed me there was still a way out. He let go of my hands just long enough to reach into his jacket and pull out a small red velvet box. When he opened it, I drew in a breath. The ring inside wasn't extravagant, it was delicate. Antique. An emerald framed by 2 slender diamonds. Julian looked straight into my eyes, his gaze unwavering, as if afraid that looking away would break the spell. This ring belonged to my grandmother. My mother wore it after her. And now, I want it to belong to the woman I believe was meant to find me. Then, without hesitation or flourish, he knelt. Claire Rhodes, he said quietly, will you walk into the next chapter of my life not as a witness, but as the one person I can't imagine it without? For a few seconds, everything stopped. My breath, my pulse, the wind. Then my heart began to race so fast it hurt. I nodded, unable to form words. Julian smiled, slipped the ring onto my finger, and it fit perfectly as if it had been waiting for me all along. He rose, pulled me into his arms, and for the first time in what felt like forever, our heartbeats found the same rhythm. When I lifted my head, he kissed me gentle, certain, a promise without language. Behind us, the sky deepened from amber to violet, the last traces of sunlight catching the vines below. In that moment, I knew that whatever the future held, I had chosen right, and the ring on my finger was more than a symbol of love. It was the key to a new beginning, where love was no longer something to question, but something to protect. Our wedding took place exactly 1 week after Julian proposed. On a gentle late spring morning in Napa Valley, there was no grand ballroom, no long guest list, no sweeping train or ornate ceremony, only a small garden behind the old wooden villa, where the grapevines arched overhead and lavender bloomed in vivid purple. Mingling with the soft scent of wild daisies gathered at dawn, I wore a simple white dress, lovingly sewn by the landlady after hearing our story. Julian wore a white shirt and a pale gray vest, his tie slightly loosened in that effortless way that was so him elegant without pretense. The officiant was a retired minister, an old friend of Edith's who lived quietly on a nearby farm. When I introduced him to Julian, he smiled and said one thing that nearly undid me. I once promised Edith that if Claire ever married, I wanted to be the one to bless her union. And today, I'm keeping that promise. There were only a handful of guests, Bill. The quiet driver who now looked endearingly awkward in a tie, a few of Edith's friends from the nursing home, and the villa owners, who had somehow become our little family during this strange, beautiful chapter. When I stepped out from the doorway of the wooden house, holding a bouquet of wildflowers Julian had picked that morning, his eyes found mine and never wavered. There was no music, just the rustle of wind through the vines and the distant chorus of birds, and it was enough. The world felt still, honest, untouched by performance or design. Julian's eyes shimmered, like the first night he had ever seen me, though this time there was something deeper, something that felt like a vow. When the minister asked whether he would take me as his partner in life, his answer didn't come as a simple yes. He turned to me, took my hand, and spoke slowly, his voice steady but full of feeling. I've walked through darkness. I've chosen silence over trust, vengeance over forgiveness. But then I met you, and for the first time I understood hope, peace, the desire to live fully for someone not out of duty, but out of love. So yes, I do. But more than that, I'm grateful you chose me. I smiled through tears. When it was my turn, I looked into his eyes and said, I don't know what the future will bring, but I know that with you beside me, I'm no longer afraid. I used to run from my past, hide behind quiet walls. But you, Julian Hartwell, you made me want to stop running. You made me want to stay. Because of you, I didn't just find love. I found myself again. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, Julian leaned down and kissed me, a soft, lingering kiss that seemed to fold both our pasts and our futures into one tender breath. The small circle of witnesses clapped, not loudly, but warmly, like people honoring something true rather than something grand. That afternoon, we rode bicycles along the dusty red paths between the vineyards, our laughter echoing through the hills like two children who had finally escaped the weight of the world. No more Mafia. No more schemes. No more ghosts trailing behind. Only us, two ordinary souls beginning a new chapter without needing a glittering cover. A simple beginning, but a real one. And I knew, somewhere far beyond that California sky, Edith was smiling because at last, I had done exactly what she asked of me: to live fully, to love deeply, and to never be afraid again. I often think of everything that has happened as a series of crossroads where, at every stop, I was forced to choose to stay or to leave, to trust or to doubt, to love or to close my heart. And then I realized that life doesn't always grant us the luxury of choosing in safety. Sometimes, we can only decide in uncertainty between rights and wrongs not yet named, between the pull of emotion and the weight of reason. Looking back on the journey from that freezing winter night in Chicago, when I was just a simple waitress stepping into a world I didn't belong to this very moment, standing as the wife of a man who once lived surrounded by shadows, I understand more than ever that love is never easy. It demands courage to take a step forward, strength to forgive, and most importantly, faith in oneself to not lose who you are at each turning point. Julian and I had to give up so much he abandoned power to live truthfully with his heart, while I gave up safety to walk into the unpredictable world he once called his own. Yet in what seemed like loss, we discovered what truly mattered: truth, trust, and a beginning that didn't need to be perfect, only sincere. Every life, in its own way, is an unfinished novel. You may not get to choose the first chapter, but you have the power to write the next ones in the way you believe they deserve to be written. And sometimes, a single choice, a phone call, or even a fleeting glance can become the quiet beginning of a chapter that changes your life forever. The story of Claire and Julian is a gentle reminder that no matter the circumstance, love, courage, and kindness will always remain real and strong enough to change fate itself. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, like, and share Underworld love stories, so that each day you can discover more inspiring tales, moving, heartfelt, and deeply human. What did you feel while following this journey? Have you ever faced a choice that kept you awake at night? Do you believe a new life can begin from a moment no one saw coming? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. We would love to hear the most genuine feelings from deep within your heart. Thank you for accompanying us on this emotional journey. Wishing you good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and love. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next video on Underworld Love Stories.